Esto es Health Tech Dialogues, un puente desde la gestión y la política sanitarias hacia la transformación digital, los datos y la inteligencia artificial.
Today we are hosting Dr. Bruce Miller, Chief Scientific Officer at the COPD Foundation of the United States.
Bruce, in terms of digital data, even artificial intelligence, what is the COPD Foundation doing these days?
I mean, with the emerging of artificial intelligence, we're trying to incorporate it where it makes sense into the work we do. You know, we work a lot directly with patients, and I will tell you, patients are concerned about artificial intelligence, you know, what it means for their privacy, the protection of their medical records. But, you know, we see artificial intelligence as another tool that can help with our research and advocacy efforts. And it's still an evolving area. So we're paying close attention, and where it makes sense, we do try to incorporate the use of artificial intelligence into the activities we do.
You mentioned that the patients are concerned about privacy issues. Is that something that they have been telling you about?
They have. I mean, a lot of the patients we interact with, particularly COPD patients, they tend to be older. You know, quite a few are technologically savvy, but some aren't. And, you know, they're concerned about technology in general and, you know, what it means for their personal information, their health information. You know, they read all the reports on the internet about scams and identity theft. So with technology, that's often a point that patients bring up.
Okay, so going to the projects, would you like to tell us about one first initiative that you're carrying from the COPD Foundation with regards to digital and data?
Well, I'll use the work we're doing with Savannah as an example. You know, COPD is a highly prevalent chronic condition. I think it's underappreciated. You know, depending on the data you look at, it's the third or fourth leading cause of death in the United States and around the world. And unfortunately, it's estimated that about half of the people with COPD are undiagnosed, so they don't know they have the disease. And the reason we were interested in working with Savannah, applying AI, natural language processing, machine learning, was to unlock the wealth of information that's available in electronic health records and try to, in a patient-friendly way, better identify those that may be at risk and potentially have COPD but are undiagnosed.
So that everybody knows, this is not prepared. The audience that listens to this podcast know that we normally don't talk about Havanas, and I never prepare any answer with the guests, of course. But you mentioned this project that we conducted together with this predictive algorithm that will help diagnose the undiagnosed. I think you call that the missing millions, right?
We do. That's a phrase we often use to describe the, you know, undiagnosed population, which we estimate in the United States could be 15 to 16 million people, which was quite significant.
That is a figure I've always been astonished about. How can that be? How can it be that there are 15 million people undiagnosed when apparently the tests or the diagnostic process you have to follow is quite simple and proven?
The process is simple. You're right. The gold standard for diagnosing COPD is spirometry to look at lung function, particularly airflow limitation. Unfortunately, most patients with COPD in its early stages, they present in primary care. And in the United States and elsewhere, spirometry is rarely, if ever, done in a primary care setting. Multiple reasons for that. And oftentimes, primary care providers don't really recognize a patient that's coming in complaining of shortness of breath, cough and sputum production, chest congestion as potentially having COPD. They may attribute it to something else. A lot of these patients are current or former smokers, so they may get dismissed, though you just have, for example, a smoker's cough. And, the follow-up usually only occurs when people continue to come back, their symptoms worsen, they continue to seek health care.
So how does it work with this predictive algorithm? Will it screen, flag the patients? How do you run it? How do you put it in practice? I know we've discussed this in the past, but people will want to know.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's still really, I would say, in the research mode. But the attractive thing about the algorithm we've developed, it doesn't require any additional effort on the part of patients and providers. It utilizes, as an important first step, the existing information that's available in the patient's electronic health record. And an advantage of the approach we used is it taps into a lot of the unstructured information, which, until the last few years really was not available for analysis. So the intent of the algorithm is to use the demographic and clinical information that already exists to identify patients that may be at potential risk, and then flag them for follow-up, which ideally would include assessment of their lung function.
Yes, regardless of this project, something that we have in our minds lately, and we've been discussing a lot internally here, and even applying to grants to try to prove this thesis, this idea, is that probably what we are going to see is a landscape where it's not anymore clinical assessment, or not even clinical assessment and test and screening, but instead there's a new layer that we can call something like a digital pre-test or digital biomarker, or whatever you want to call it, that we are going to perform on the populations. And then only the ones that, according to the algorithm, are more prone to have the condition, then will go to the test. I'm thinking, for example, of breast cancer, just to go out of COPD for a second. We screen people based only on gender and age. But the reality is that the risk doesn't depend on this. It depends on many other factors. And this goes both for leaving people that won't have this risk in peace and they don't need this test. And for the opposite, maybe there are women out there that are 30, but for whatever reason, they're more likely to have this. So probably we will see an environment where we will run these digital tests before, and then we will decide who we should screen. I don't know if you agree with this vision, and if this is something that we will see in respiratory diseases too.
I do, and I think for COPD and respiratory diseases, we are moving to that paradigm. I was involved in some work that an observational cohort in the United States did, the COPD gene study, and we just published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association to propose a new definition of COPD, which doesn't remove lung function, but it makes the argument that COPD is more than just about lung function. So it heavily focuses on aspects like symptoms, it, pathological changes in the lungs. So lung function alone isn't the sole criteria that can be used for COPD. And when patients present to their health provider, they're driven to seek health care because their symptoms are bad or worsening. So that is really, I think, the first cut. If a patient's complaining about a problem, they should be followed up just like you would in other diseases. And the diagnostic test can help confirm the diagnosis, but as we argue in this JAMA paper, it's no longer the be all and end all.
Yeah, I didn't know this article, but from the title, did I understand that it's going to include also the genomics of the patients or not necessarily?
Potentially, there is a genetic or quote genetic version of COPD called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So that gene defect is well known to result in early COPD, particularly emphysema. You know, Other genetic factors that drive COPD are less clear. There are some genes that do show associations with COPD. I think it's probably premature to use them as far as screening, but we do recommend that all patients with COPD be tested for alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency because then they're potentially eligible for replacement therapy.
I've been reading lately also about the difference between classification or what we would call diagnosis in medicine and prediction or forecasting. Because what we're seeing with machine learning and AI is that more and more is not only that we can diagnose the patients better, we can phenotype them better, but we can also do that in advance. And we have this very prominent breakthrough in the last weeks with Alzheimer's disease, where now we have a test by which we will know who will have this disease 20 years in advance, which is incredible, but it's happening. It's not science fiction. So, and this same week I was reading the same with breast cancer. It's not only AI for breast cancer screening, now it's AI for predicting who will have a breast cancer, which again changes the paradigm. I'm not sure if within respiratory diseases, this may be potentially of interest too, or maybe because it's more behavioral, it's less interesting. But at the same time, precisely because you can do something about it, it's actionable. Maybe it will be good to tell people, look, you have a more, let's say, sensitive lung, and the AI is telling us this. I don't know what you think of this paradigm.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting approach, and I think it is relevant to chronic lung disease, including COPD. And we've had a number of discussions within the foundation about how we can move this type of effort forward. Right now, I would say it's premature. There is no biomarker or biomarkers that are strongly predictive for who as an individual will get COPD. Population studies have identified important risk factors, but for an individual patient, we're really not at the point where we can say your profile is X, Y, and Z. That means you're going to develop COPD.
Then it's clear that that's the next frontier, I guess, for this disease.
I think the field would certainly love to be there. And one of the challenges is even people with the most important risk factors, one of which is, tobacco, cigarette smoking, only about 20% of smokers get COPD. So the majority don't. And identifying at an individual level who will develop COPD or who won't, we're not there yet.
Imagine it changes everything for this condition, and
And
that's so interesting.
patients they'll tell us that, because we really advocate for smoking cessation programs. But some patients, they know this data and they'll say, "Oh, I only have a 1 in 5 chance of getting COPD, so I'll take my chances."
Yeah, and in any case, the truth is the truth, right? So if you
Mhm.
can tell someone that will be really, really interesting. So at the beginning, you mentioned that there are some other areas of attention for you as a society where you see that AI is bringing applications of interest. Is there any other project or area using artificial intelligence that you want to share?
I mean, Currently, there isn't. I mean, for our research programs, we're still trying to identify the best way to incorporate the use of artificial intelligence. A lot of the research we do is with sponsors that come to us for specific projects, particularly for patient engagement, so the how we apply tools like AI to those projects, I think we're still in the thinking stage.
With regards to the quantified self or the ability to have apps on iPhones and so on that change the way in which we interact with patients within clinical trials, within observational studies, though there are probably new trends, right? That the foundation is maybe considering, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, our interaction with patients, we do a lot of traditional surveys. So we'll ask patients, 15 or 20 questions about a topic. We'll conduct focus groups with a small set of patients to have a dialogue about a particular issue that we think is of concern to our patient population. For a number of clinical trials now, interactive apps is certainly being used. That's both the case for observational trials and for interventional trials that pharmaceutical companies do. And, a concern for our patient population because they're older is they may not be receptive to these types of technologies, but in fact, that's not the case. Many of our older patients, like I mentioned earlier, they're actually quite technologically savvy, and they like these interactive approaches because it makes them feel like they're more involved in the work.
And talking of research, this is going a bit off topic, but I can't resist to ask you the new trends in the political landscape in the United States. Is it affecting the programs? Is there something that is worth mentioning in this regard?
I think it is, and it's having an impact on how we approach particular advocacy work. It's certainly affected the work we do with a number of academic institutions, where federal grant funding has been reduced or is at risk. It's created uncertainty for pharmaceutical companies about what the regulatory and reimbursement climate will look like. So yeah, I think unfortunately in the United States, it's affected all aspects of our work and every single institution or person we interact with. And our patients are very concerned because a lot of our patients are on federally funded healthcare like Medicare and Medicaid. So, they're concerned about what that's going to mean for their healthcare coverage in the future.
Bruce, at first, more at personal level, did you have the chance to try and use generative AI, large language models? Is this yet already a tool for you?
We do use it for some of the writings we do, some of the material we prepare, because it's much easier to edit something when you have something to work from rather than starting from a blank piece of paper. But we don't rely on it solely. I mean, the final product always undergoes significant human review. But we have found it useful as a starting point, just to start to get some thinking going, get some information down on paper.
We read recently that the FDA is now going to use this type of technology to assess the new technologies, the new drugs, which
Hmm.
is, if you think about it, it's surprising, right? At the end of the day, it's AI evaluating AI in a
Hmm.
way.
Yeah, and I think, and I think there's a place for it. but you can't replace the human factor completely. I mean, the FDA is going to be under challenges with people leaving, and the cutbacks in resources. So I think they are looking at these types of tools to help with the work they do.
I don't want to put you in trouble with this question, but I can't resist. So in the United States, there's a huge problem with access to care, and primary care is part of it. But then we have these incredible tools that are getting better and better at clinical reasoning, clinical judgment. They're simulating human interaction more and more. Do you think that in such a country with this type of healthcare system, with all its flaws and everything else, uh, there may be room in the coming years for a certain level of automation of the evaluation of the COPD patients? Do you think that there is a place for substituting or improving part of the process using machines and automation?
Yeah, and maybe not substituting, but certainly for improving care. You're right. The issues with access to care, it's not just about dollars, but a lot of patients live in areas where, rural areas, other underserved areas where there's just nothing available locally. And for some of them to see the provider they need to see, it could be a several-hour drive, one way. And, that's typically very difficult for people that are sick, and they don't want to do that. So I think, AI, computer technology, for these types of patients is a potential tool. And in some cases, it's already being used. Telehealth is becoming more and more common in the US. For COPD patients, pulmonary rehabilitation is an important treatment that has clearly shown to have benefit, but access to a facility that has pulmonary rehabilitation is challenging for many patients. So, it's estimated that less than 4 or 5% of COPD patients that should have pulmonary rehab actually get it. So, these types of, computer technology apps on their phone, provide the potential to deliver these kinds of care.
Dr. Bruce Miller, it was a pleasure, as always, to talk to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ignacio. I enjoyed the conversation.